can't think of anything myself. So tonight, Patrick, you're going to do a presentation of necessitarianism, this fundamental theme we seem to be preoccupied with for so long. And it's very peculiar that it should be something that would be a serious concern for everyone, because again, I think it's a very easy concept to get a grip on, and it's
well, we certainly should discuss that. Why it is that almost everybody has an intuition that that is not actually the case. But let's discuss that later and just see first what Spinoza has to say about it. Yeah.
We live as if it's not the case, but it's easy. What I'm saying is that it's a perfectly easy concept to understand.
I think most people are shocked by it when they first hear it. Given that most people think that we have free will, if you then tell somebody who maintains that we have free will that in fact everything could not be different from what it is, that really is liable to come as quite a shock or a surprise, at least. In that case, let's have that discussion later. Nick suggested last time that it would be interesting to explain Spinoza's conclusions about plenitude and necessitarianism, invoking only the principle of sufficient reason and no theology. So as a first pass, that's what I propose to do. And then later on in the evening, I go in detail into Spinoza's theological arguments and explain what else Spinoza adds to the mix that way.
Yeah.
So I think we can have a discussion after the first part, where I would just present plenitude and necessitarianism as consequences of the principle of sufficient reason. And then, unfortunately, that's probably going to take more than 30 minutes. We will probably have to interrupt the proceedings before we're through with that. But let's see how it goes. Okay, everyone see it?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, so the convention I'm following here is that anything in italics is my commentary. Anything not in italics is a quotation from Curley. This document, I showed you a preliminary version of it last time, so I've just added a bit of extra stuff here about plenitude. Remember, plenitude, I think, is best summarized in Proposition 16. From the necessity of the divine nature, there must follow infinitely many things in infinitely many modes. Everything which can fall under an infinite intellect. And Proposition 35, whatever we conceive to be in God's power necessarily exists. God creates everything possible. So I've glossed it this way. If something is possibly the case, it is actually the case. And if you strip all of the theology from Spinoza's arguments, this is what I find as the core reason that he advances for this position. This is the second proof of Proposition 11, the proposition that God as he defines it exists. Remember, God as he defines it is maximal in every possible respect. So his argument in Proposition 11 is that if this God does not exist, there must be something outside of God to prevent his existence. And that's impossible by the way he has defined God. So what you see here is a an invocation of a very strong form of the principle of sufficient reason. For Spinoza, it is axiomatic that for every state of affairs, there is an adequate explanation or a sufficient reason for why that state of affairs obtains. And that state of affairs could be the non-existence of a particular thing. If something doesn't exist for Spinoza, that can only happen if there is a sufficient reason for its non-existence.
Okay, Blake has his hand up.
Yeah, Blake?
Yeah, there's a simple way that I understand this, and perhaps you might want to comment on it. Imagine a number line where all the positive numbers go this way and all the negative numbers go this way, and all the numbers are on the line. So in a way, what Spinoza is saying that all numbers that could possibly exist are on that number line. So since in his mind these lines go on forever, there's no number that's not on the line, every possible number. If there's a number that can't exist, so let me give you an example. A negative number greater than 3. Well, that obviously can't exist because it's a contradiction. But all numbers that can exist are on that number line.
So everything that can possibly exist does in fact exist. That's the way I've glossed it here. If something is possibly the case, it is actually the case. Then there is the sort of converse of this position, Necessitarianism, which states that, well, as I've glossed it, if something is actually the case, it is necessarily the case. So he first states this in the Scholium to Proposition 17. The first part of this Scholium is just a restatement of Proposition 16, which is here at the top of the page. From the necessity of the divine nature, there must follow infinitely many things. He's already used the word necessity here, but in the Scholium, he's now going to really amp up the rhetoric to say that all things have necessarily flowed or always followed by the same necessity, and in the same way as from the nature of a triangle, it follows from eternity to eternity that its 3 angles are equal to 2 right angles. The angles add up to 180 degrees. I don't see how it's possible to read this as anything other than a hardcore statement of necessitarianism. Some people do, including Curley. I haven't read Curley's essay on this, but I know that Curley, for one, does reject the idea that Spinoza is a necessitarian. In the opposite camp, you have notably Michael de la Roca and Don Garrett. Yes, Blake?
Perhaps you can explain the difference between necessitarianism and just determinism.
Well, I think of it in determinism in physics. Determinism says that if you completely specify the state of the world at any given time, and you know all of the laws of nature, then the future evolution of the world is uniquely determined. The future is uniquely determined by the past if the laws of nature are given. That's not quite the same as necessitarianism, because necessitarianism says that the entire history of the world is uniquely determined, including the initial conditions and the laws of nature. In a word, it says that there is only one possible world. Another formulation, in nature, there is nothing contingent. contingent meaning could be otherwise, might not have been, could have been different. And of course, most of us do think even of ourselves as being contingent beings. We say to ourselves, well, perhaps our parents could have married somebody else. Okay, things could have turned out differently because we don't know the entire causal history. So it's easy for us to imagine how things might have been different. But Spinoza says, despite our imagination, in fact, it is not the case that things could have been different in any respect.
Yeah, you
And he
can
also,
you can have contingent determinism, right? You can have something, a limited entity that has been determined by a cause, an effect that's been determined by a cause, but the cause is not necessary. So you could have a sequence of um, contingent causes and effects, right? So let me interrupt everybody at this point. Okay.
about, I believe that what you are driving at is an argument which I think was first formulated by Leibniz and then taken up by Curley. I'm not sure, that sort of confuses determinism and necessitarianism. The way Leibniz, I think, got out of necessitarianism, you understand that Leibniz convinced himself that he had avoided what he called this precipice,
Yeah.
the precipice of necessitarianism.
Yeah.
Okay, by saying that the word was perhaps produced by an infinite series of cause and effects, but that series itself was contingent, created by a free will of God.
Right.
And Spinoza rejects that. We'll see why later.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay.
Sure. If you look closely
We'll
at
come back
Leibniz,
to
just
that.
by the way, if you look closely at Leibniz, you realize that even God did not actually have a choice, but Leibniz just made the case that despite the fact that God could have only chosen the very best of all possible worlds, he nevertheless made a choice. And that's the only point where contingency lies in Leibniz's system. But go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Just wanted to clarify.
Okay, so let me.
And necessarily Santa Claus must exist.
Yeah, it's the
And
conception.
that doesn't sound rather seem right.
It's the conception is not merely a fantasy.
Well, okay.
If it actually corresponds to reality.
So
no, I mean, there is a tradition in philosophy of conceivability arguments, which I think ought to be just thrown in the garbage, all of them. Okay, because somebody says that I can conceive of a pill that cures cancer, and this is what follows.
exactly.
It's nonsense.
That's a lot of people have conceived of God, so same problem. But okay, I mean the point is most people would say, you can say that maybe everything has a cause, maybe everything is determined once you find it, but if you don't find it, then there's nothing much to talk about until you find it. So whatever exists may be of necessity, exists by some cause, or has a reason for it after you find it, not a priori.
Yeah. Could I just finish this up, and then we'll come to a discussion about the principle of sufficient reason, which is what we're really circling around here. So let me just finish this. The real question here is, so is my screen being shared? I don't think so.
Well, you can share it. Whenever you're ready, you can share it.
Good. Okay. Good. Okay. Spinoza makes very strong statements about necessitarianism, including that God does not have free will, that things could have been produced by God in no other way and in no other order than they have been produced. Okay, there is only one possible word for Spinoza, that's this world. So his argument for plenitude is a simple invocation of the principle of sufficient reason. Okay, and implicitly he's saying the same thing for necessitarianism. Okay, that the principle of sufficient reason entails necessitarianism. Okay, if you have a particular state of affairs, according to the principle of sufficient reason, there is a sufficient reason or an adequate explanation why that state of affairs, in all of its minutest details, why that state of affairs obtains, why it could not be otherwise, why it is necessary. So this is, I think, obvious. At least it's obvious to me, but there is a sort of perennial question of whether the principle of sufficient reason in this statement, in this degree of generality, actually does hold. There's a very good article on this subject, which you can find a link for on the web page, the article by Michael Della Rocca. And he discusses a proof, a purported proof by Van Inwagen, which claims to show that the principle of sufficient reason implies necessitarianism. He purports to give a formal proof. Because he's actually writing an essay on free will, this is the title of his book, you can understand what he thinks of the idea of necessitarianism. He sees necessitarianism as a reductio ad absurdum of the principle of sufficient reason. On the other hand, Della Rocca is in favor of the principle of sufficient reason and necessitarianism. He has no problem whatsoever with drawing the implication. As it happens, this proof by Inwagen is actually now recognized to be flawed. It's flawed for mathematical reasons, which I'm not going to enter into unless somebody actually presses me and I can give a bit more of an explanation for it. As far as I personally am concerned, the principle of sufficient reason is really just a pragmatic approach to using our intelligence. We have to start, if we're going to think about anything at all, we have to make an initial assumption that whatever it is we want to think about is intelligible or comprehensible, at least in principle, even if it escapes the limitations of human reason to actually find an adequate explanation for whatever phenomenon is of interest to us. It's sort of like there's a principle called the uniformity of nature, okay, which says roughly that in similar circumstances, similar results or consequences are going to ensue. And you can't do any scientific investigation unless you assume that something like that is true. You need something that will guarantee that experiments will produce reproducible results, or else you can't do any scientific investigation. I think the principle of sufficient reason has that sort of status. If we're going to use our minds at all, we pretty much have to assume that it's true. Della Rocca's argument is essentially pragmatic. Okay, what he It's an argument in favor of the principle of sufficient reason, where the way it unfolds is that he says, look, everybody uses this implicitly all the time until they run into theological problems or conclusions from the principle of sufficient reason that they find unpalatable. And then what they try to do is draw an arbitrary line between phenomena which are explicable and phenomena which are inexplicable in principle. And he presses the case that nobody can actually draw that line in a principled way. So the argument that he presents for the principle of sufficient reason is really just a pragmatic one. And I don't think it's necessary to sort of get on board with these metaphysical arguments in order to follow Spinoza's ethical doctrine. I mean, when Spinoza says it is in the nature of reason to regard things not as contingent but as necessary, he doesn't say that you have to accept this abstract metaphysical principle. He just says if you're going to use your mind to understand something, you have to assume that at least it must be intelligible in principle. And there are several statements like that. Insofar as we are intelligent, we desire only that which is necessary. So he says, and this one, rather grandiloquent, but it has a certain ring to it. What altar of refuge can a man find for himself when he commits treason against the majesty of reason? So I would just add one more thing before opening up the floor to discussion. That was that I pointed out last time that it's possible to prove that necessitarianism and plenitude are logically equivalent. Each of them implies the other. I'll do one of these implications. Suppose to get a contradiction, okay, let's suppose necessitarianism is true and plenitude is false. To say that plenitude is false says that there is some proposition which is possibly true, but its contrary is actually the case. If necessitarianism holds, then what is actually the case is necessarily the case. In this case, we're assuming that not X is actually the case. If not X is actually the case, it is necessarily the case. If it's necessarily the case, then X cannot possibly be the case. That's a contradiction. I'm not going to go over that again. It's there for anybody to work out for himself, and the same sort of gymnastics can do the implication in the opposite direction. Plenitude implies necessitarianism. I'm not going to go through it. I personally don't find these abstract metaphysical arguments really convincing because they don't have the sort of affective oomph that Spinoza says is necessary in order to have a practical consequence for our lives. I'll just point out one other thing. Okay, so if necessitarianism holds and plenitude holds, what we're saying is that everything that is possibly the case is actually the case. Everything that is actually the case is necessarily the case. So everything that is possible is necessary. And this is known in philosophy as modal collapse. And I just want to point out that I'm not misrepresenting Spinoza in saying that this explicitly is the position that he takes. And this is in the first Scoldium to Proposition 33, where he says that a thing is called contingent only because of a defect of our knowledge. If we can affirm nothing certainly about a thing's existence, because the order of causes is hidden from us, it can never seem to us either necessary or impossible. So the only dichotomy he's allowing is that something, if it's not impossible, is necessary. A thing is either necessary or impossible, and this is modal collapse. Okay, so I think we could break there because the rest of the presentation will concern the extra stuff that Spinoza adds to this from a theological point of view. I'll just mention that Spinoza doesn't directly invoke the principle of sufficient reason either to support plenitude or necessitarianism. The way he proceeds is to use the principle of sufficient reason to prove the existence of God as he defines it. And from the existence of God, he then deduces both plenitude and necessitarianism by theological arguments. So in the second part of the presentation this evening, I'll go through those theological arguments. But I think we probably already have enough on our plates to have a discussion at this point. So I can perhaps take down the screen unless there's some particular part of the text here that somebody would like to raise an issue about. Shall I close the share screen? I'll do that then. Okay.
I had a quick question.
Yeah.
So, what is plenitude? Because I think I'm mixing it with a different definition.
Okay, this is called the principle of plenitude by somebody called Arthur Lovejoy, who wrote a history of this idea. And in its theological form, it's whatever we conceive to be in God's power necessarily exists. God creates everything that it is possible for him to create.
So God creates plenty? Or
Well, not plenty, but everything possible. That's
okay.
the claim that Spinoza
Everything
makes.
completely.
Everything that could possibly be created, according to Spinoza, God does in fact create.
Not to be confused. Not to be confused with the idea that we all get plenty to live on.
Yeah, well, we also get the downside of this.
Katie?
Buddhism as well, as I'm checking for understanding whether I'm understanding. Buddhism says there's no such thing as coincidence. Is that an accurate paraphrase?
It could be. I wouldn't. I don't have any quotations offhand to back it up, but certainly. Well, everything is perfectly managed in the unborn. Does that sound like a Spinoza statement? I think it does. But I don't know. Would anybody else like to jump in here? I'm not an expert.
I don't really know anything about Buddhism, but if I may, I just like to talk about very quickly, I'll make a couple points about this whole the principle of sufficient reason. And it was a very common notion. Leibniz used it extensively as well. And Malebranche, for example, you know, it was just something that he just took for granted. Many philosophers did. And the reason is that when you think of a cause, when you see the word cause used by Spinoza, a cause, of course, we know now that any cause an effect follows necessarily, right? Whether we're talking about the infinite sequence of cause and events in naturata, or whether we're talking about everything that follows from the essence of God. Necessarily, it follows from the essence of God. And so Spinoza often uses the word cause, but the word cause is very extensive in Spinoza. It means, and quite often means, a complete explanation, a comprehensive explanation for any given moment in the world. There's a complete and comprehensive explanation. That is an explanation that, of course, is provided in rational terms. So there's a very close link. Some people would even say an absolute identity of what we would understand as being something like an ordinary efficient cause and a complete rational explanation. So therefore, physics and logic are almost perfectly coincidental in Spinoza. And again, this is not unusual. This was the case for many other philosophers of that time. The reason is because they had just discovered through Newton and various, Leibniz himself, for example, had done a lot of work and had determined that they could provide an account, the physics of the 17th century, they could provide a rational account for every event that transpired in the realm of nature or anything within the domain, the realm of physics, right? It could be, you could provide a rational explanation. And so because of everything, because they had these laws, if you could provide a rational explanation for anything, that could only happen. You can only provide a rational explanation if there is no contingency. If there were any contingency whatsoever in the realm of physics, then you couldn't provide a perfectly logical, demonstrative proof of anything. So that's something that's to bear in mind. And what else I very quickly want to say about this? That's enough. That's all I have to say. It's just something to remember, that cause for Spinoza often means nothing other than a rational, not just explanation, but even demonstration, because any effect follows of necessity from a cause. Okay, so go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, and I think that this is what underlies the parallelism of the attributes. You know, there's a one-to-one correspondence between things or states of affairs and the ideas in God's mind of those things.
Yeah, Nick, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I'm in a public place, so there may be some background noise. So let me know if it bothers you. But am I audible now?
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay, thanks, Patrick, for that presentation. Very nice. So if I can go slowly with a few key concepts that I find interesting. The first one is this idea of principle of sufficient reason, PSR. Implying necessitarianism. Okay. So you said that was originally proved by somebody, but then it turned out that proof was found to be faulty.
That's
so
right.
Therefore, that line of thinking now is being repudiated. So we are not going to pursue that, right?
The proof has been repudiated, not that line of thinking. Della Rocca, for example, is an extreme rationalist who accepts that necessitarianism is a consequence of the principle of sufficient reason. It's just that Van Inwagen tried to do something in his proof that turns out to be logically flawed. He tried to form, okay, suppose there are contingently true propositions. If there are infinitely many of these, then the construction that he tried to perform, which is to form a conjunction of all these contingently true propositions, that actually turns out to be incoherent. And it's incoherent for a mathematical reason, which I'm not sure we really need to go into. It has to do with Cantor's hierarchies of infinity. So it's generally agreed that Van Inwagen's proof is flawed but I don't think there is universal agreement on the question of whether PSR implies necessitarianism or not. Is that clear?
Okay. Okay, I see a couple of hands. So let me just be brief without getting into the details of the steps, but just try to get the conclusions clear in my head. So when Michael de la Rosa continued to think PSR together with necessitarianism, was he proving that from PSR we can conclude necessitarianism, which is one scenario, or was he saying, well, we can think the two concepts together, even though the mathematically robust proof of PSR leading to necessitarianism may not be achieved?
Well, I think that my reading of De la Roca is that he views necessitarianism as a consequence of PSR, but hasn't actually offered a proof, other than the informal argument which appears to provide the implication. If PSR is true, there is a sufficient explanation for why any given state of affairs obtains, why it could not possibly be other than it is. That's necessitarianism.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, got it. Thank you. So the second line of argument then is Spinoza will use another attack, right? He will argue from a theological way for his conclusion of necessitarianism. That's great. So my question is, okay, that's okay. And so my question there is, not to dispute the conclusion, I don't really care. I want to get to the power of the argument. Okay. So in Spinoza's deduction or reasoning of his conclusion of necessitarianism, did he or did he not rely on PSR?
As far as I can see, the crucial invocation of PSR is in the second proof of Proposition 11, the proof that God exists. This is where this passage that I quoted is taken. For each thing there must be assigned a cause or reason, as much for its existence as for its non-existence. Okay, a thing necessarily exists if there is no reason or cause which prevents it from existing. This is the fulcrum on which the second proof of God's existence depends. Okay, so here he is invoking a very strong form of the principle of sufficient reason to prove the existence of God as he defines it. God as he defines it is maximal in every possible respect. So if you like, plenitude is just built into the definition. Because God creates everything that is possible, Spinoza says that everything that is possible must necessarily be the case. God acts by the same necessity whereby he exists, according to Spinoza.
Great, got it. That's very clear. Yeah.
We'll try, as I said, when we get back to the text here, we'll go through the theological arguments.
Yeah, got it. So the takeaway for me would be Spinoza, PSR was important for Spinoza.
Yeah, just as for Leibniz. And Leibniz stated also a very strong form of the principle of sufficient reason. Leibniz managed to convince himself that necessitarianism was not the case. There's a very amusing story about how Leibniz and Spinoza met. Leibniz appears to have been deeply disturbed by this meeting because he realized the threat that necessitarianism posed to his own philosophy. There's a book, if anyone's interested, called The Courtier and the Heretic, that tells the story of this meeting.
Okay. Okay. We gotta hear other people speak about this very quickly. I just want to say it's just not a matter of Spinoza defining God as having an essence from which all things necessarily flow. He's proved that, right? He's proved that, and by the time we reach Proposition 16, he's demonstrated that. So the onus is on us to find whether it is a valid proof or whether we can find something that is, problematic with the proof, right? Okay, go ahead, Lali.
Yeah, so I was just looking up some stuff on my phone because I didn't really do my research beforehand. But actually, it makes sense in the context of what I've been reading about Spinoza. So he grew up learning a lot about theology, and it was in the Age of Reason. So he's trying to put together like theology and reason to make like a concrete understanding of I don't know whether you say metaphysics or like whether God exists, this kind of stuff. So he's definitely trying to unite those two sides. I mean, I haven't examined the argument in particular, but I just thought that was interesting. And then I also thought what was interesting is that he's Jewish. So I don't know if there's like a different take that he had, or if people like Christian societies had a different viewpoint as to whether his philosophy was legit or not. But I definitely think I can see how he's trying to bridge the two things together in making his own philosophy of God.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that his perspective was very different from the Christian one, and we'll see that. Okay, we're going to go through his theological arguments on this subject, and it really is radically different from Christian theology, but rooted in medieval Jewish or rabbinical theology, with a nod to the Arabic philosophers and the scholastics as well.
I'm sorry, Alex, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Sorry, just figuring this out here. Hi guys. Yeah, Patrick, thanks for the presentation. Wanted to ask, I guess, follow up on parts of that, and also, Rob, what you were saying earlier about Leibniz versus Spinoza. So the first part, I think, Patrick, you had in your presentation that kind of bottom line for Spinoza is that everything is either exists necessarily or else is impossible.
Right? He says that, yeah.
That kind of a dichotomy that it comes down to. And I was wondering, trying to think of this in terms of what I think is a Leibniz distinction between analytic truths and truths of fact, right? Or later, I think they're called synthetic truths by Kant. And it seems to me like Spinoza is not drawing a distinction there. Like for him, there really is only one level. And
that's right.
It's something like analytic truths.
Yeah, for Spinoza, all truths are necessary truths.
Right.
Which is the case for analytic truths.
Right.
Yeah, okay. The only, I guess, necessary truths that most of us recognize are truths in mathematics and logic. But Spinoza is saying it goes all the way through.
Okay.
That's what he's saying. Yeah.
So the only kind of a condition, so analytic truths, I mean, they follow by the principle of non-contradiction, right? Like a triangle not having 180 degrees is a contradiction in terms, right? That can be shown. And it seems like, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems that Spinoza's vision is that this applies to facts as well. If
That's
only
it.
we
That's
could.
it. That's exactly it. Okay.
Right.
But of course, we as finite intellects are not in the position to trace the full
Right.
logical chain of implications or chains of cause and effect.
Okay. And so the Leibnizian position, so the reason I guess why Leibniz sees this as such a danger is that it doesn't leave room for another kind of truth, which would be something like the truth of
Absolutely.
choice, of
Or
will.
God's goodness. God's,
Right.
yeah.
Right.
And in
Okay.
fact, we'll see Spinoza explicitly referring to that when we get to the Scholium to Proposition 33.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's what I wanted to, kind of run this.
Yeah, you've put your finger on the I think this is sort of the fundamental feature of Spinoza's metaphysics, what
Right.
marks him out as being different from pretty much everybody else in the Western tradition.
And I guess it explains, I mean, this whole business of the geometrical method. Like for him, that's no accident. It's
for Spinoza, there was no difference between mathematics and physics. So they were one and the same.
And I think,
enterprise.
Rob, that's what you said earlier as well. Like that's the
I think that and I think it's quite true as well that the 17th century physicians all thought that what am I saying? Let me try again. The people who were studying physics were applying mathematics and recognizing that physical laws were truths of necessity. And that was for all philosophers just the most valuable thing, because they could finally transform, the world into something that was absolutely, they could demonstrate that something was absolutely true of it. And they just went from there. I mean, Descartes was the leading figure in this respect, and certainly the news spread from Descartes to virtually everywhere in the world. Someone like Hobbes, for example, the foundation of his philosophy derived from Descartes' physics, and Spinoza himself relies on Descartes' physics, and so that's really very important, that physics can be rendered in mathematical form, and it's of necessity. Mathematics is either valid or invalid. It's either demonstrably true or, somebody's made a mistake. Okay, go ahead, Daniel.
Okay. I've got a number of questions. So I guess what you're arguing also is that science basically uses a principle of sufficient reason. And if I understood you correctly, that it operates on that principle, assuming that there's always some reason, some explanation, and there's consistency. But I guess and if I understand correctly, that this principle applies both to contingent truth and necessary truth. Is that correct?
No. A contingent truth is something that might have been different, that might have been otherwise.
If you allow contingency into the world of physics, then you can't apply mathematics. I mean, the notion of applying mathematics, when mathematics, there's nothing contingent, right? There's nothing vague in mathematics. Everything is absolutely precisely true or false, and that relies on the assumption, the basic assumption, that everything that transpires in the realm of physics transpires of necessity. There's nothing contingent, so they just go hand in hand.
So if I'm going to brush my teeth in 5 minutes, that's a contingent truth after I do it.
It appears that way to you, but not to Spinoza.
So that's what I'm saying. So there's no
Yeah.
real difference between contingent and necessary truth when you apply the principle of sufficient reason, right?
No, Spinoza's statement is that a thing is called contingent only because of a defect of our knowledge.
Okay.
Is that clear?
All right. Okay. That's what I'm driving at to some extent. Yeah. Because this leads me in a way to my next point. I was wondering, why is it called the principle of sufficient reason? Why don't we just call it the principle of explanatory reason?
Well, obviously.
What's the idea of the term sufficient?
It's easy to provide partial explanation for things.
I looked up the Stanford Encyclopedia and principle of sufficient reason. The first example they give is interesting. You go to a market and you buy some cucumbers for $5. That's the example they give, and two people come after you, and one person is charged $1 and the other person is charged $10. And you ask, what's going on here? So you can have all kinds of explanations, and you may find some of them sufficient or perhaps not. Maybe some discriminatory element, depending on who, where the customers come from, etc., what their nationality is, blah, blah, blah. And that may satisfy you as a sufficient reason for that behavior, but clearly it doesn't cover all the facts, and the facts in the case are almost infinite, that causes and effects that apply to that interaction. So it's almost like the principle of sufficient reason applies to the nature of your quest, the nature of the question that you asked, whether it'll satisfy you sufficiently, which it probably never will.
Okay.
And ask you more and more
questions. I think I can answer you, Daniel. For Spinoza, what it means is that the explanation has to be, of whatever phenomenon you want explained, the explanation has to be sufficiently good that it can explain why the phenomenon could not be other than it is.
But I guess what I'm picking up here also is that it's relative to your initial quest, to your initial question.
Daniel, listen, when you talk about sufficient reason, there's what is necessary for something and what is sufficient for something. What is necessary means that has to be the case. Something has to be in the cause. It's necessary in the cause in order to have this effect. A sufficient cause is a complete explanation. It's a comprehensive explanation. The word sufficient here means a complete and comprehensive explanation for an effect from a cause. That's what necessary or sufficient means here in this case. It's what it always means. Okay?
Okay. And one other point, I mean, just again, I don't have a question. I mean, if you take quantum physics today, it's, some people say that quantum physics is inherently, you inherently cannot understand it and can never have a sufficient reason, or that would be Bohr's position, I guess, that you never would have a sufficient reason to explain quantum mechanics. So
it depends on the interpretation, Daniel. There are deterministic interpretations of quantum mechanics which are consistent with the principle of sufficient reason. I actually put a comment in the on the meetup page asking if this topic needs to be discussed. The question of determinism and indeterminism in physics. I was hoping to get some feel for how much interest there was in this particular question. As it happens, I didn't get any response. So I'm concerned that if we go off down this rabbit hole, it's not going to be of interest to most of the members of the group. But anyone who wants a Spinozist friendly interpretation of quantum mechanics should read about the Maniwar's interpretation, which is consistent both with determinism and plenitude. But
Yeah,
let's not
absolutely.
let's not go down there.
No, yeah, not
down
now.
that
Okay.
route. Yeah, yeah, okay.
Alex, I'm sorry, Ella, you seem to have been waiting a long time. I don't know what's going on. Perhaps, Alex, we should
I
let
have been
Ella.
waiting a while.
Okay.
Yeah, I have. Other people have spoken a couple of times. I don't know what happened. Maybe I accidentally hit it or something, but that's okay. Yeah, so this goes back a ways, but it refers to something that no one has brought up yet. I think the monistic substance, I'm just going over my notes. I'm looking at Spinoza has, of course, a monistic substance, right? And of which actual occasions are an inferior mode. And anything possible to exist does exist. Okay, so in this monistic substance, with actual occasions, anything possible to exist does exist. How does Spinoza order, what is the nature of an extent of all of this substance? Do ideas exist as well as substance? Do his geometric proofs, are they limited only to what we can measure with geometry, or is there something beyond that today, chaos or something we cannot know about or measure? And yeah, that's it.
Maybe Blake, you'd like to try to answer that?
I didn't fully understand the question.
Try again, Ella.
Wait,
Okay.
one thing I heard her say one thing that I actually wanted to have
Can I
answered.
explain my question? Okay.
Yeah, sure.
I just want to re-explain it because I really want an answer and I waited for a while. Okay. So we've been over this. Spinoza's philosophy is based on a monistic substance, of which actual occasions or actual modes, let's put it that way, actual modes are inferior, I don't want to use the word representations, but actual modes are elements of that monistic substance. Okay, we've been over that. Is there anything possible to exist that that doesn't exist? I know the answer to that is no. Everything possible to exist does exist. Now, my question is there anything, what is the nature of all these possibilities? Is it just substance? Is it substance and ideas? So the nature of these modes and this substance and these modes, what is the nature of them? Ideas, substance, or both?
Well, under the attribute of extension, it's every possible arrangement of energy and matter. Under the attribute of thought, it's every sufficient explanation of such configurations of energy and matter.
So every possible thought, and what was the second part? I'm sorry, I didn't get it.
Well, it's easier to see this in the attribute of extension. It's simply every possible configuration of energy and matter,
Okay.
permitted by the laws of physics.
Okay.
And then for every mode under the attribute of extension, there is a corresponding mode under the attribute of thought. That's if you like God's idea of the mode under the attribute of extension, and it's simply the complete explanation of the physical configuration.
Okay. I see. And
So for Spinoza, nature is a thinking thing. God or nature is a thinking thing. Okay, the divine creation is manifested in parallel in nature and in God's idea.
okay. But where does the monadic part? It's all
all
one,
expressions of the one substance.
one substance. There we go. And is there time involved in it?
That's a very good question. Time comes in the infinite chain of cause and effect. Okay, that the system of modes is governed by causal determinism. Okay, in extension, it's the sequence of mechanical causes, efficient causes that result in the production of a given mode. And under the attribute of thought, it's the logical chain of explanation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, thanks. I wanted to just comment on a couple of things that were said by a few of the people. Like Lally, forgive me if I'm saying your name wrong. She was talking about initially about what Spinoza's goal was and that he was trying to understand metaphysics and how things worked. And that's not his goal. That explicitly was not his goal whatsoever. His goal was to find supreme and unending happiness. That's what he says his goal is. And in one of his letters, he explicitly says that he's not trying to explain anything in physics. He just is trying to understand enough of this metaphysics to get to where he wants to do, where he's trying to go, which is supreme and unending happiness. He talks about this in the first 3 pages of Emendation of the Intellect. So that really explains his goal. Okay, so that was the first thing. The second thing you said was merge religious notions with rationalism. No, not really. I mean, he was, in a way that's right, in a way it's wrong. He was brought up in an Orthodox Jewish environment, that's true. But he, on one hand, he escaped it completely. So there's very little or no overlap between what he talks about and Judaism or Christianity or any of those things. There's really no overlap. I mean, his definition of God is so completely different. It's unrecognizable, really. But he did use words like God, which are so different in his sense, because when a person of Christian or Jewish or Islamic faith talk about God, they're talking about a separate being that thinks like a person and gets jealous and is anthropomorphic, gets jealous and wants to get angry and all these things and wants you to follow certain rules and stuff. That's the Judeo-Christian God. But Spinoza's definition of God is completely different. His word of God is just your word for everything, or universe, or something like that. He's just talking about nature. He's not talking about any kind of separate thing, and he's not talking about something that thinks like a human or gets angry or any of those kind of things. So I hope that helps with that.
Oh, were you
Okay.
talking about what I said?
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, I'm a girl, female.
Oh, yeah, I can see you.
Okay, just checking because you were saying
You look
he,
like a
blah, blah.
female.
No, I was talking about Spinoza.
I was hoping that, like, but whatever.
I didn't reference you. I was referencing Spinoza, and he was.
You know what? I mean, I think I feel really bad for Spinoza now since, he wanted to get ultimate happiness and he just ended up with this theory that ultimately, I don't know if it brought him
No, I
happiness,
think
but
he found what he was looking for. And what he
What?
found what he was looking for, number one. And number two, it's unrelated to his situation.
yeah,
Right.
I see where you're coming from.
Okay, and then Daniel.
Robert, can I suggest, since it's 9:30 and we need to get through the theological arguments,
Yep.
that we need to sort of limit the discussion at this point. We can
Okay,
open it up again
I'll let Alex
afterwards.
all right, I'll let Alex
Yeah.
and Nick speak, and then we'll
Yeah.
move on. Very quickly, you guys just have like a couple minutes to make your points, okay, Alex?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Rob. Well, I mean, thinking a little bit more about some of those issues from before, and I'm thinking of something that I've heard, a position that's sometimes called voluntarism. And I guess I'm trying to map, like, what would be the complete opposite to Spinoza, just to kind of map him on a territory, so to speak. And it does seem like voluntarism would be it, right? Like a position that says, like, I think there are some people, who might say, who might even deny the principle of sufficient reason, might say, it's God's choice that things happen the way they do. Like everything is like a little miracle, a little intervention by God. And it does seem to me like
plenty of philosophers think that. Descartes.
Yeah.
Descartes thought that God could, of his own free will, create the nature of the world in any way he chose. In other words, he could, remember in Leibniz, we were talking about the eternal truths, right? God couldn't break those eternal, God was subject to the eternal truths, the eternal laws, right? Where for Descartes thought that God created the necessity that we find in mathematics or geometrical forms like a triangle and things like that. Or Malebranche said, and these guys were very serious, very, very diligent, and really quite impressive in their bodies of thought. And Malebranche thought the only way that we can explain the world is have God intervene with a little miracle all the time in order to coordinate our experience of mind and the extended world of matter. That was, so God was involved in all the details of the world. So there's, contemporaries of Spinoza who were thinking in exactly the opposite way from necessitarianism.
And I guess their main principle, I mean, in that regard, would be faith, right? Like you believe in a miracle. And it seems like that's for Spinoza is really dangerous. Like he doesn't want to have anything to do with faith in the will of God, maybe in one's own will as free. And it seems like he just takes a really extreme position on this intellect.
We will see that in the as I go through the theological arguments. He is very radical, Spinoza, along the lines that you're suggesting.
Okay.
Nick.
Okay. Thanks.
Nick?
Yeah, that helps. Thank you.
Yeah, just briefly, I want to add a footnote to the exchange between Blake and Liley. Wolfson, who is a scholar on Spinoza, had a very nice characterization of that situation. He said, Wolfson said that Baruch Spinoza was the last of the medieval scholastic who was very versed in the Abrahamic tradition of philosophical logical thinking. And Benedict Spinoza was among the first of the modern Enlightenment rationalist generation.
That's very true. Yeah.
Baruch was like Spinoza as a young man, still preoccupied with the Kabbalah and and scholastic philosophy and theology in general. But Benedict was somebody who was a strict rationalist, and but this is what Patrick's going to start talking about right now.
Yeah, let's come back to that in the light of Spinoza's theological views. But I'll just add, apparently in his library at his death, there were more theological books than there were books of any other stripe. So theological concerns were in his mind throughout his life. On the other hand, he corresponded with scientists such as Robert Boyle, Oldenburg, the secretary of the Royal Society. He was extremely well versed in 17th century mathematics and physics. So his project indeed was to reconcile to just as Descartes was, although his resolution was very different. His project was to reconcile two radically divergent traditions. Let's see how he did with the theology. So I'm going to share the screen again. So I'm now going to cover the same ground, but referring explicitly to Spinoza's arguments. So proposition 29, this is a restatement of Necessitarianism. In nature, there is nothing contingent, but all things have been determined by the necessity of the divine nature to exist and produce an effect in a certain way. This is really just a restatement of proposition 16, the one that says that everything that falls under the infinite intellect necessarily exists, and causal determinism, proposition 26. Next, we have the distinction between natura naturans and natura naturata. The background here, well, in order to understand why Spinoza thinks this is important, Wolfson explains that for the medieval theologians, there are four attributes of God involved in divine causality. They are will, God's intellect, God's power, and God's life, or his existence. So according to the doctrine of divine simplicity, all of these are expressions of God's essence. But Spinoza has a different classification. He uses the term natura naturans, nature, naturing, to refer to God's essence. That's the substance and attributes. And later we'll see that he identifies God's power and God's life with God's essence, but not God's will or God's intellect. For Spinoza, God's will and God's intellect belong to natura naturata. That's the system of modes. Remember, there are finite and infinite modes, and all of these are governed by causal determinism. This is what causes the creation to unfold in time. Eventually, in book 2, we'll see that he's going to identify will and intellect and say that they are actually the same thing, but that's for later. The main point is that for Spinoza, God's will and God's intellect do not pertain to God's essence. Okay, they belong to the system of modes, and that means that they are governed by causal determinism. This is proposition 29. Okay, so he says, an actual intellect, whether finite or infinite, must comprehend God's attributes and God's affections and nothing else. Of course, for Spinoza, there is nothing other than God's attributes and God's affections. Remember, the affections are just the modes. The distinction between finite and infinite intellect, of course, is the distinction between the infinite intellect of God and man's finite intellect. So he's just saying the object of intellect must be God, the attributes and modes of God. Wilson points out that the intellect or thought as an attribute actually enjoys a privileged position because the object of thought can be both the attribute of extension and the attribute of thought itself. Some people have tried to interpret Spinoza as an idealist on the strength of this. I don't think that's really a very convincing reading. Proposition 31, the actual intellect, whether finite or infinite. So he's now talking about all of our mental activity, will, desire, love. Okay, must be referred to natura, naturata. That's the system of modes governed by causal determinism, and not to natura, naturans, which is God's essence. There's, I think, an important scholium to this. He says, intellect is always actual and not potential. So I believe the way to read this is that intellect is an activity. God is a thinking thing, not a catalogue of static ideas. And there's no suggestion anywhere in Spinoza that such a catalogue exists anywhere, that, you know, in human readable form, waiting to be discovered. It's not clear to me, reading Spinoza, that God's intellect is expressed by anything other than the finite modes, but it's unclear. So here we come to proposition 32.
Actually, we can delve into that a little bit more. I think you know, the active intellect, to be active or actual as opposed to potential, just simply means that the intellect is essentially an activity. It's never a potentiality. Because, and if you were to think of God, you would say, well, what was it that activated God's intellect? Well, there's nothing outside of God to activate God's intellect. So it's just
yeah. But also, I think what he's saying is that it's not, God's intellect is not a reservoir of static ideas. It's the dynamic process of creation, of nature as a thinking thing. It unfolds through natura, naturata.
Yeah, it unfolds through naturata. And also, I think, you know, that's also something worth looking at a little bit, because when you say that it's only in naturata, what that means is that the world has moments of God's thought everywhere in the world. Every dimension and extension has a thought, but God doesn't have any sort of choice about whether he's thinking a thought about that little moment of extension in the world, right? It's God's thoughts follow the world necessarily, and he's not free to think anything outside of the world. Do you know what I mean? Like his world.
Yeah, he also seems to be saying that God's ideas are not written down anywhere. They're not cast in.
Well, I think you're suggesting potential thoughts, or you're thinking potential thoughts.
Well, no, it's just it unfolds through the activity of creation. That's the way I read it.
Yeah.
Perhaps perhaps other readings might be possible, but he does insist on this.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is that, you know, we as human beings are under the illusion that we can choose to think about something, choose to concentrate on something, and that you know, whether or not we have a latent body of knowledge that we draw upon on thinking, that's another problem. It's just a matter of, in the case of God, his mind is a body of ideas that are identical in terms of the substance with all of extension, and that is the only thing he thinks. He doesn't have thoughts outside the realm of reality.
That's right.
Naturata
unless perhaps in the other attributes, which we don't know about.
Oh yeah, I think that the implication is that God has thoughts for all the other attributes and all the dimensions that we don't know about. God has thoughts about those thoughts, and God also has thoughts about the thoughts that he has, of course, right? So
That's
thoughts
true. Yeah.
are special. They have thought, you can have thoughts about thoughts, and you can also have thoughts about extension, and you also have thoughts about the infinity of other, the world under all the infinity of other attributes as well. So thought is kind of special in that way. Nick, did you have something?
Yeah, just quickly, clarification, Patrick.
Mhm.
Intellect
Mhm.
is one of the attributes of the God substance that's revealed to us. So did the Spinoza also apply the concept of intellect to human intellect?
Yes, we have to be careful here. The attribute is the attribute of thought, and the intellect, the infinite intellect of God, is an infinite mode that follows from the attribute of thought. And a particular subset of that is the finite human intellect. Does that answer you, Nick? I'm not.
It does,
Nick?
and thanks for
Yeah.
clarifying the thought. What is intellect? So my question then is, I rephrase it.
Okay.
Does humans' intellect is
Mhm.
also always active but not potential?
Well, this is something that, well, we're not going to be able to sort this out right now, but the human intellect is a mutilated or a partial subset of God's intellect. The humans have inadequate ideas, whereas all of God's ideas are adequate, and it's because of the limitations of the perspective imposed on us. According to Spinoza, all of our man's ideas are actually ideas of his body. Okay, how the body is modified by other things in the attribute of extension. And we don't have adequate ideas of things outside of us. So the human intellect is a mutilated or partial subset of God's intellect. All that's going to come up in book 2.
Okay, great. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, good. Okay,
let's quickly
Alex,
see what Alex
Just a very quick follow-up on this. I'm curious, as we talk about God's intellect, the human intellect, if Spinoza means to attach to that any kind of personality. So in particular, I'm very struck by this infinite intellect as the immediate infinite mode in the attribute of thought, which seems to mean that the entire attribute of thinking is encompassed by this infinite intellect.
That's right.
I'm wondering, would Spinoza attach any kind of personality to that? Any kind of like maybe a selfhood or ipseity or anything along those lines?
I'm reluctant to sort of try and pronounce on that definitively, because I think you can find traces of personality if you look hard enough in Spinoza and other statements that seem to rule it out completely. Let's just keep an open mind on that until we've progressed further into the book, and then some of us may come to different conclusions about that than others will see.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Okay, proposition 32, the will cannot be called a free cause, but a necessary cause. So this applies both to God and to man. Okay, and the reason is that it's because for Spinoza, it's included in Natura, naturata. We'll see why this is an important issue for Spinoza in the second scholium to proposition 33. So here now in the corollary, the two corollaries, he's going to explicitly deny the idea that God has free will. Okay, God does not produce any effect by freedom of the will. He says that will and intellect are related to God's nature as motion and rest are. I highlight this because this is the first mention of motion and rest. That's the infinite mode under the attribute of extension, the immediate infinite mode. But the main thing here is that for Spinoza, God cannot be said to act from freedom of the will. Will does not pertain to God's nature, to God's essence. Okay, but what is the case is that it follows from the necessity of the divine nature, that's from God's essence, and the chain of causality in the system of modes, that everything is determined to exist and be produced by divine necessity. Hopefully this will become clearer in the Scholium to Proposition 33. Okay, this one here. But let me just come back here. Here's, I think, an important point. Okay, so God does not have free will for Spinoza. And I think that this is the key difference between Spinoza's God and the impersonal will of Schopenhauer. I'm sure some of us have read Schopenhauer and recognize that Schopenhauer is, in a sense, Spinoza's evil twin. So there's, I think, a reasonable question to ask: why is Spinoza's God a source of joy, and Schopenhauer's impersonal will, why is that a source of misery? And I think the key difference is that for Schopenhauer, the will is arbitrary and random. Okay, whereas for Spinoza, the God does not act by freedom of the will, but by necessity. Everything that happens to us is necessary and could not have been otherwise. Whereas for Schopenhauer, we're just being fucked around by this arbitrary, random will, which is just brutal and instinctive and governed by no reason at all. So it's just a perspective on how to make sense of this idea that God acts only by necessity and not by freedom of the will. So here we come to Proposition 33, which for my money is the most important proposition in Book 1. Things could have been produced by God in no other way and in no other order than they have been produced. Just for fun, I've restated the proposition here and deleted the phrase by God. You see, if you take it out, it actually makes no difference to the import of the statement. And if you just suppress God here, then you see that really there is a case to be made that God is actually playing no role whatsoever in Spinoza's metaphysics. It's sort of open to discussion. Here's an interesting quote from Einstein, which suggests to me why Einstein found Spinoza to be such an attractive figure. It's in a letter that he wrote to another physicist, where he says, "What I'm really interested in is whether God could have made the world in a different way. That is, whether the necessity of logical simplicity leaves any freedom at all." Spinoza explicitly denies that it does. Okay, so he's actually suggesting that there might exist a physical theory with no arbitrary constants of nature or laws of nature in it. Obviously, pure speculation, but you see the influence of Spinoza and Einstein's thought here. Another interesting consequence of this proposition is that it implies that all of the properties of a given thing are necessary. And that undermines the distinction between accidental and essential properties of things, if all properties are necessary. And it also calls into question of whether it really makes sense to talk about individual things at all, since it seems to suggest that the properties of things are acquired through their interactions with other things. And that maybe is ultimately Spinoza's view, that there is really only one thing, the one substance. But let's now look at the argument that Spinoza advances in favor of this proposition, which I think is perhaps the strongest statement of necessitarianism in Spinoza. The argument goes like this. He says that if things could have been different, then God would have had to be different, because God and nature are one and the same thing. But he's already proved that there is only one substance. So it cannot be the case that the order of nature could be different from what it is. If it was different, that would imply the existence of another God, another substance. That's Spinoza's argument for necessitarianism, rather than a direct invocation of the principle of sufficient reason. So I already pointed out the first scholium, okay, modal collapse, where Spinoza says that a thing is either, if it's not impossible, it's necessary. Scholium 2, I've broken it up into several parts because he ranges over a number of topics. The first thing he says is that things must have been produced by God in the highest perfection. This is worth thinking about, because for Spinoza, there is no problem of evil, no theological problem of evil. What Spinoza says about good and evil, we'll see in due course. But what he's done here is completely inverted Christian theology. It's almost a truism for the medievals that God is the most perfect being. But Spinoza, and of course that nature is grossly imperfect, and of course human nature even more so. This is the standard theological view of God and nature. But Spinoza has identified God and nature, so the dictum that God is the most perfect being applies to nature. And he now says that things have been produced, all things have been produced by God with the highest perfection, and necessarily produced by God. So this is altogether different from the Christian theology. In Christian theology, you have to try to square God's omnipotence, God's omniscience, with the idea that God is supposed to be omnibenevolent, that by an exercise of his free will, he somehow makes the best of all possible worlds. And, Augustine had to invent the idea of free will, human free will, in order to let God off the hook for the problem of evil, the theological problem of evil. But
that's only moral evil. That's only moral evil, though. Augustine also allowed for what he would refer to as metaphysical evil, which means like, anything like, mortality, for example, or disease and pain and, all these different things outside the moral realm.
God's free will allows evil to exist. You have to provide some way of palliating that idea, okay? Because God is supposed to be omnibenevolent. So what Augustine had to do was, out of whole cloth, invent the idea of human free will in order to let God off the hook for moral evil.
Yeah. Also, I think it was worth mentioning here is that when Spinoza speaks about perfection, he's not speaking about it he's not making a value judgment. He's not saying the world is perfect in the sense that it is perfectly good or perfectly, beautiful or anything like that. He's just saying when he says perfect, he means it is the richest, it's been fulfilled. It's been fulfilled completely. Plenitude, the principle of plenitude and perfection are almost exactly the same.
He is clearly and deliberately leveraging the rhetoric of the medieval theologians, for whom God was the most perfect being, the most real being and the most perfect being. That phrase comes up all the time in scholastic theology, and Spinoza is using this formula to in his.
But at the same time, the way that the theologians would use the word perfection, like, let's just say a very traditional thinker like someone like St. Thomas Aquinas, he would, he would say, okay, God has created a perfect world, but at the same time, St. Thomas Aquinas would recognize that there's a great deal of evil in the world, right? So it's just not like the theologians.
Yeah, but I think we agree on the basic point here. Okay, that for Spinoza, there is no theological problem of evil.
That's certainly true. I'm just simply saying that perfection for Spinoza means it is almost identical with the word plenitude. It just means it's the
we're going to see this time and time again. Spinoza is using religious rhetoric for his own purposes.
Okay, we'll call it it.
Yeah, well, we'll see that. Okay, now coming to this question of why Spinoza denies free will to God. The first reason that he offers here is simply that he says that attributing an absolute will to God is a great obstacle to science. What he means here is that the common view that an earthquake or a tsunami can be explained by appealing to the will of God is what he calls in the appendix the sanctuary of ignorance. It's no explanation at all. That's the first objection. Second, he gives more objections. Okay, he says, suppose for the sake of argument that will pertains to God's essence. Okay, natura naturans rather than natura naturata, then he says that if it were the case that things depend on God's decree or will alone, then the perfection of God would require that his decrees be immutable and eternal. Okay, this phrase, the way he expresses it, he says that in eternity, there is neither when, nor before, nor after. Eternity is timeless for Spinoza, as it was for Plato. Now, if that's
Can I ask
the
a quick
case,
question?
sorry, let me finish. If
Okay.
that is the case, okay, that God's will or his decrees would be immutable and eternal, then nothing could ever actually happen because God's decrees could never change. And he repeats this argument that if God's will pertained to his essence, then changing his decrees would change the nature of God, therefore there would be two gods, but he's already proved the uniqueness of substance, so he discounts that completely. Finally, he takes a swipe at the idea of that God acts to produce the best of all possible worlds, that, you know, God's actions are determined by a principle outside of himself. He dismisses it pretty much out of hand. Nothing more absurd can be maintained about God. So I will waste no time in refuting this absurdity. He's very hard line about this. I don't know if Leibniz had actually formulated this at the time when Spinoza and Leibniz met, but certainly it was in the air. Okay, the idea that God acted to produce the best of all possible worlds. Spinoza is having none of it. There is only one possible world for Spinoza.
Can we quickly go to Lally's question?
Sure.
Yeah, sorry, it's really quick. So I just wonder why Spinoza is debating the will of God. I mean, I've heard of free will and that being like a debate within theology, but why is he even wondering whether God would have a will if that's kind of more of a human anthropomorphic thing?
Well, it's certainly the standard Christian theological view that he is arguing that, okay, his position is that God acts by the same necessity whereby he exists. Okay, that everything is governed by necessity. And that it flies in the face of traditional theology, which maintains that God's creation was an act of divine free will. Is
Got
that clear?
it. Yeah.
He's arguing against the stand. I certainly wouldn't say that it was a necessarily even a theological point of view, but it certainly was the common view. You know, your local minister is going to preach to the congregation that God has the free will, and but a lot of theologians had already recognized that necessity obtains in the nature of God, absolutely, right? There isn't anything like contingency. So that would already remove free will from the equation. And certainly any of the philosophers.
Yeah.
Leibniz was often set up as being a kind of a Christian philosopher, but he doesn't allow, quite frankly, for free will in God either. And this possible worlds thing is something, as you look very closely at, you realize that God didn't really have a lot of choices. As a matter of fact, he could only choose one, because only one world was the best. And that was the only expression of anything that could remotely be described as free will on the part of Leibniz God. So, you know, all of this, I think that, okay, I'll say, I won't say any further.
Well, let's just say that Spinoza is out to defeat the metaphor of God as a lawgiver or a legislature who decides arbitrarily what moral and physical laws
absolutely
are to govern. That's clear.
Yeah, that's true.
Okay, so next proposition. Here he does identify God's power with Natura, naturans. I found this quote interesting. It's not in the Ethics. It's in the Metaphysical Thoughts. Therefore, we understand by this term life the power through which an object preserves its own being. Moreover, the power by which God preserves his being is nothing else than his essence. Therefore, they speak most truly who say that God is life. What's interesting about this is that he actually tributes the conatus to God, okay, the power by which God preserves his own being. He's later going to say that the endeavor to preserve our being is the actual essence of man and the only foundation of virtue. But he also attributes it to God himself, and identifies God's life. That was the fourth classical attribute of God, according to the medievals, with God's power, with God's essence. And here again, we have another statement of plenitude. Okay, whatever we conceive to be in God's power necessarily exists. And one final proposition, I'm not quite sure why he tacked this on. It seems obvious. Nothing exists from whose nature some effect does not follow. I think this is just intended as a bridge to the appendix. If you remember, in the appendix, one of his main themes is that God does not act with an end in view. Okay, there is the suggestion that God is the efficient cause of every phenomenon, and these phenomena unfold mechanically through causal determinism. So we'll see that, I guess, next week when we cover the appendix. This seems to be just a bridge to the appendix. So that brings us to the last proposition in book one. So I'll now close the share, and we'll take up the discussion again.
Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick, for that. A couple of quick thoughts. I mean, you mentioned Schopenhauer, and from those last couple of propositions, or I think the two second to last, I could really see why Nietzsche was so taken with Spinoza, which I think he was.
Oh, indeed. Yeah.
You know, and that notion of will to power is so interesting, because I wonder if it may be a sort of marriage between Schopenhauer's will and then this kind of vitalism that seems to be there in Spinoza. A kind of, you know, like life and power are more essential than will or intellect. Right?
Well, certainly there are passages in Nietzsche where his debt to Spinoza is very clear. You know that, but then there are also passages where he contradicts himself, as he contradicts himself on pretty much everything. They're definitely, it is clear. I mean, he claimed, Nietzsche, that he was thrilled to have discovered a precursor in Spinoza. And we'll see that the conatus for Spinoza, the endeavor to persist in being, doesn't have the amoral flavor that it has in Nietzsche. Spinoza builds his ethics on top of this principle that the only foundation of virtue is the conatus, which is the endeavor to persist in being. But his ethical doctrine is, shall we say, much less wild than Nietzsche's ideas on morality.
Yeah, it seems that the existentialist version of it would sidestep, I mean, really the principle of sufficient reason, which I think is what Nietzsche does in a way, right? And so what would Spinoza be like if somehow the principle of sufficient reason were as if amputated? You know, that seems to be the Nietzschean project in some ways.
Well, yeah, it's been so long since I've read Nietzsche that I can't I can't make an intelligent
I think that, you know,
response to that. Yeah.
You know, if you think of Aristotle, the nature of man, the ultimate end for the nature of man is thinking, right? And I think for Spinoza too, the fullest expression of the power of man, the conatus expresses itself most completely in thought, and rational thought. And and that's also true of Aristotle. You know, our ultimate end is to think, and to think rationally, and that is I think ultimately the happiness that Spinoza finds is the freedom to think rationally, and that's the greatest pleasure that you can have in life. And or maybe not necessarily pleasurable, although it is for Aristotle, but for Spinoza, to think freely is the best thing, the best life. But for Nietzsche, you know, he was like, you know, we're partly animals, you know what I mean? So just this sheer kind of visceral expression of power is really important for Nietzsche as well. You know, so I don't think that you'll discover in Nietzsche, apart from the fact that they're talking about the expression of power, anything really in common with Spinoza. At least I would imagine so.
We'll see that later. That for Spinoza, the mind's conatus is to understand, and the emphasis is going to shift to as we get to the sort of Spinoza's ethical doctrine, that Spinoza is basically going to say that man's freedom or salvation is to be found through the power of the understanding. That's just an understanding of our situation within the metaphysical context that that he's laying out in book one.
Mm-hmm. So I hope that somebody else has a question to ask or a comment to make. I think it's important to recognize that everything that when you talk about the power of God, really what you're talking about is very interesting. It's like it's part of God's essence to exist, and he has certain kinds of attributes, and from those attributes follows the world, and it follows of necessity. And there is one question, I'm not sure whether or not perhaps somebody might provide me with an answer, but I don't want to talk about why is there something as opposed to nothing. I don't want to talk about it on that level, but why is it that the world is expressed with complete absolute plenitude? Why do infinitely many things follow in infinitely many ways from God's essence of necessity? That's a question that I'm kind of curious about, you know? Anybody? No? I mean,
Well, I
do know.
think that oh,
No, go ahead.
I was gonna say, well, if you make God to have made everything and like practically everything, all the concepts, everything, then whenever you need sufficient evidence for like the existence of a thing, you have it. It like covers his bases.
Yeah, that's true. But my question specifically is why plenitude? Why does the essence of God, who has existence of his essence, so we know why some things follow from the essence of God, but why is there an infinite variety of infinite things? Why do they follow from the essence of God? How come there's no point in time where the essence of God is sort of exhausted?
Well, the sort of God, he has defined God that way. Remember, there are absolutely infinitely many attributes, each of them infinite in its own kind. And then he has given us an ontological proof, okay, that says that the existence of God basically follows from the definition.
Well, wouldn't infinity imply that automatically?
That definition does become as valid as any proposition, right? He proves that God has an essence and that it involves existence. So everyone's sort of missing my question, and I won't pursue it any further. Go ahead, Ellen.
Yeah, I was going to say some sort of creativity in nature so that things can differentiate and propagate and flourish. so creativity in nature would be the reason of things.
Yeah.
Robert, what do you think?
Well, I think that I think if Spinoza were here, he would say, okay, first of all, I've already explained to you how there isn't anything beyond substance, and substance is like, especially if you look at any one of the attributes, it's infinite in the sense that nothing can impinge upon it. You know, it cannot be limited, right, except by itself. So if there isn't any reason for the substance to be limited by itself, then it just follows of necessity that it's just going to be infinite in every way, you know, like it'll just go forever. That's what Spinoza would say. But I guess the question that I have is a matter of why should substance have in its nature something like what we would describe as the ever-expanding universe, you know? But that's not a very good analogy. But nevertheless, the notion of an ever-expanding universe, you know, why it should go on forever.
Well, why not?
Well, I think that's what Spinoza would say, actually. According to the principle of sufficient reason, he's saying, unless you can come up with a reason explaining to me why there should be a limit, then it's infinite, period. You know, don't fuss about that.
Yeah, there you go.
No, he would say, I think he would say, there is a principle of sufficient reason why it keeps expanding.
Yeah.
We don't actually know what it is.
Yeah, but it would be in the negative form, right? You can't offer me a reason why it doesn't go for infinity, so therefore we just assume that it will go for infinity, as opposed to providing a positive explanation of like, it should go for infinity because this is the nature of substance, you know. But I'm willing to go along with it. I'm just sort of curious what people thought about that.
Doesn't substance include the definition of infinity? It's part of the definition of substance.
That's right.
So therefore, it has to include all possibilities. That's what infinity means.
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
Yeah.
But the definition is one thing, the proof is another, right?
Yeah, well,
and the only proof that I know of that I can recall that makes any sense to me, because I don't like to, the notion of attributing conatos to God as substance is a little bit strange, because conatos is the striving to maintain our being, or if you like, the full realization of our potential, right? I really want to think rationally and then I'll be happy, but things get in my way all the time. But in the case of God, there's nothing constraining God at all in his nature. The substance that is God is absolutely free. So conatos I really wouldn't apply to God or nature itself or the substance itself. I forgot what I was going to say, but nevertheless, that's all. I guess that's all.
You asked for comments. I just want to make one more comment. Patrick, that was a great presentation. It's one of the clearest understanding I've had of Spinoza in a long time. Thank you.
Well, I wanted to say, yeah, Robert, I think maybe I have a question that's similar to yours in a way, because what I keep wondering about, so we've seen that in God's intellect and God's will they pertain to Natura, naturata, I believe, right? So in a sense, they're derivative, right? They're not the essence. And I keep trying to understand, okay, so what does it mean to relate oneself to God's essence, which would be God's power and God's life, I think. And to me, that's very strange because, you know, kind of naive idea of God would be, well, God thinks and God wills, you know, chooses to do this or that, create this or that. But Spinoza is saying there's something deeper, actually, about God that really is the essential. And that is this power of, you know, creation. I think that's connecting with your question, this power of, you know, things just kind of flowing out of God, or emanating. I don't know what to say.
Yeah, but I think you've just put your finger on it, Alex. That the natura naturata is the creation, and God is the power that's driving the creation. It seems simple to me.
Mm-hmm. And so when we try to think about that power, so it's not a choice, nor is it really an idea that somebody is thinking. There's something deeper that goes on. And that to me is, I mean, there's almost something mystical to that. You know,
Well,
like,
there is, in the sense that if I read Spinoza correctly, the intellect can't direct itself to God's essence. It's what's prior. So it's you know there's this rather obscure passage, Robert, in Proposition 21, where he talks about God's idea of himself. Do you remember?
Yeah.
Okay, it seems to, at least my reading of it, is that it can't actually direct itself to God's essence, God's idea of himself. It's looking outward from God. But it's so obscure that I can't be sure that I've read it correctly. But the
Well,
overall,
I think that's an interesting way of looking at it, because if you were to think that it was looking out, like in other words, God's mind would be complete in terms of representative ideas of nature, right? And in a sense, at that point, you recognize a number of things. Like, for example, God has no self-consciousness. He only has actual ideas of moments of extension in the natural world, as well as the other attributes that we don't know about. And it's not like God is anywhere doing anything at all. It's just like, he's sort of like the ideal spectator of a painting. You know what I mean? He just gazes at it, doesn't do anything with it. He just gazes at the painting and reflects the painting in his thought, and that's it. The Spinoza's God really is a lot like Leibniz's God, who doesn't really seem to have anything to do at all. So anyway,
yeah,
Lally, go ahead.
it's us finite modes who are burdened with having things to do, not God.
is there a sense in which, I mean, can I just follow up quickly on this? If, let's say, we're trying to understand, okay, what is this essence, or how do we relate to it? Could it be that it's not so much thought, it's not so much will that gives us the essence of God, but what if I was to become aware of my own life force, would that be more of a contact with that?
Yes, Alex, I think definitely. This is what I think comes out of Book 5, that what Spinoza is saying that the human mind can come to understand itself as following from the necessity of the divine nature, that all of its operations are determined by God, and that's what he calls blessedness. It's hard to say anything about that without descending into mystical language.
But the other thing too is that intellect is actually like with the human intellect, we can know the essence of God. Our intellect, our limited intellect, can know the essence of God, and part of that reason is because insofar as our mind is intellect, which is a very rare thing, let me assure you, but every once in a while a human being actually uses their capacity for pure intellect, and they can know the essence of God. And
I totally disagree with that. I don't think that by using your intellect, you can know God. I think God is actually pretty unknowable. You may think you have arrived at a concept of what God means, but how are you to know that's actually what's God's true nature? I mean, and again, it's a human conception. So I don't
Yeah,
think,
but
well, I mean, I just disagree.
a rational understanding is a true understanding, and a true understanding is a truth, an eternal truth.
Well, I
So
think if we determined all truth based on like rational thinking, yes, sometimes, or maybe like 98% of the time, the rational and logical thinking would be correct, but the other percent of the time, it wouldn't make sense. So you couldn't use rational thinking to talk about something like God.
well, that's
You could
completely
try,
contrary. That's
but yeah.
completely contrary to everything that Spinoza stands for.
Well, no. In fairness to Lally, Spinoza is eventually going to talk about the limitations of rationality and talk about a third kind of knowledge he calls intuitive knowledge, which traces a direct connection between the essence of God and the essence of particular things. This will become clear in book 2. He although he says that proofs are the eyes of the soul, he also, or whatever, I forget the exact quote, he also recognizes the limitations of his entire system. That that's why eventually what he's going to do is prescribe what can only be called a spiritual practice, which he calls the intellectual love of God, in order to understand what he's talking about.
Yeah. So anyway, Ella had a question, but then Ella disappeared. So I'll just keep an eye out and see whether she's going to come back. So what I think that everyone should understand now is that that we are in a situation, according to Spinoza, where everything that happens to us, we have absolutely no choice about. Okay, there's no choices involved, and that entails a revaluation of everything that we would ordinarily think of as being morality. And that's going to be the next step. And also, there's a very interesting section on sense experience and the nature of the body, you know, and the relation between the mind and the body and everything else. That so now we're going to change subject radically in book 2. It's going to become quite fascinating, book 2. And you know, Blake's not here, right, Patrick?
I don't see him, so I guess he got called away. I didn't expect. We actually have to make a decision about next week.
Yeah.
The appendix. I would urge anybody who has a substantial disagreement with Spinoza to be the one to present the appendix, because he's going to restate many of his positions in a very provocative way. For instance, he has what I think is a knockdown argument against free will. And it's clearly one of the major hurdles to, I mean, if this is a new idea to you, the idea that we might not have free will, it's something that, you know, we need to get to the bottom of if we're to progress, because Spinoza's ethical theory has actually nothing whatsoever to do with that concept. I just mentioned that as one example, or his denial of teleology. You know, the idea that God acts with an end in view. This is elaborated at great length in the appendix, and that also takes a good deal of getting used to. But it's just a thought. So we do have to decide who will present the material in the appendix next week. The week after that, we would normally start on book 2. As it happens, Robert, I won't be here. So I'll miss that that first meeting on book 2.
Okay, well, if you will not be here for book 2, I'm going to have to ask for a vote for at the end of next week, whether or not people want to look at things like, for example, intermediate modes and the relation between the infinite modes and the limited modes, because that's not really very
Well,
clear to me.
it seems to me that we could easily accommodate that next week with the appendix.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
that's
mean,
what
and perhaps any other loose ends that that anyone would like to propose for discussion. I had the impression that Ella wanted to discuss quantum mechanics, but I was just reluctant to go off in that direction unless there was a more widespread expression of interest in that sort of topic.
Well, quite frankly, I don't understand
Yeah.
this whole thing. It's almost like if somebody comes along and demonstrates beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is accidental things happening in the realm of physics, that for me doesn't even impinge upon Spinoza's philosophy. You know what I mean? I'm perfectly willing to accept that.
Well, if it was the case, it would say that the principle of sufficient reason is not universally applicable.
Yeah, and it would also say that
Um,
it would also mean that we cannot use rationality ultimately in
Well-
science, and it would just mean the kind of a collapse of everything, you know. So I
well,
think,
yeah. So it's a question whether we, in this meeting on Spinoza, we need to go off on a tangent like that. I don't know. It's really up to the group.
right.
Well, doesn't the indeterminacy principle, Heisenberg's principle, say that you cannot determine the nature of these particles? You can only predict them statistically, but individually, it's inherent in the nature of the atom that you cannot know all its attributes. That's what the indeterminacy principle says, which is contrary to what Spinoza advocates.
Yeah.
I think it would be a great discussion.
Well, that's the issue. I mean, I think what needs to happen is perhaps some exchange on the message board for the group or something, just to clarify what issues, if there are loose ends that we need to tie up before proceeding to book 2.
Okay, so what I think the agenda for next week will be, theoretically, somebody's going to volunteer to do the appendix, which in a way is just a prose expression of everything that he's already demonstrated in the propositions earlier. So that's still, nevertheless, it's a nice read because you get a good sense of Spinoza's personality. And then also I'll look at infinite modes, mediate modes, and limited modes, and how they relate to one another. Just so everyone can get a pretty solid sense of what the ontology is all about, and then we can just start to move into, human experience. How's that sound?
Sounds good. Somebody will have to write up a blurb for we'll have to update the web page.
Yeah, how did you do that?
How did I do what?
How did you update the meetup page the last time?
No, I didn't. I didn't. No, what I'm saying is that if we're now going to tackle book 2.
Oh, yeah, I don't know how that meetup page changed because I didn't change it. So all of a sudden there was a different. Anyway, it's all a mystery to me.
I'm not aware of that. I'm
Yeah.
just saying, okay, I want you to bear in mind that I will not be here for the meeting in 2 weeks' time, which
That's
is
right.
when book 2 presumably will get underway.
Hey, you know what? I don't think I will be either.
Well, then we have to, we have to, well, whatever. We have to work something out.
I won't be. I won't be here next Thursday, the 11th. I won't be here on Thursday, 11th. So.
Well, we're Saturday. The meeting is on Saturday.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. 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 So I'll leave it. I'll leave it in your capable hands, Robert.
Isn't today Thursday? I got a little mixed up there, folks. So okay, yeah. So I'll be here.
So you work it out with Blake.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's it. I guess it for tonight.
Yeah.
No controversies. I'm just sort of disappointed. But anyway, it was all very informative.
Cool.
Okay, so thanks everybody, and
Okay.
I hope you enjoyed it. And we'll see you
Okay,
all.
so Blake, just before you go, you will then upload the video to YouTube, and I will download it again for editing if necessary.
Yeah, whatever
Okay.
we did last time, I'll do that.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
And there'll be 2 videos because we interrupted the meeting.
Oh, that's right. That's going to, yeah. Okay, I'll have to sort that out.
Yeah, so you can
Thank
probably
you.
just.
This was interesting.
Okay, you're welcome.
You're very welcome.
Okay,
Lally.
good night.
Thanks. Great
Okay,
presentation.
good night, everybody.
Great,
Okay.
Patrick. Really.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Glad you liked it.